Hey, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. this time. We have a really excellent guest on today. I know I say that a lot, but, well, all of our guests are great, but this one is especially good because it's so timely on what's been going on in relation to the to the Hamas Israeli war that's raging, that's almost nonstop on all of our TV screens this day. And it's very clear that one of the key issues at stake here was a huge failure of the Israeli intelligence service and the subsequent response to that. And we have with us today one of my colleagues, Mike DiMino from Defense Priorities, who is a former CIA officer and now is a senior fellow at Defense Priorities. And he's got some great experience in dealing with a lot of the kind of terrorist mentality. I think ISIS and several other things he'll tell you about in just a second. But he has a great insight and direct experience, recent experience, on how some of these things work. He's got some really good insights into maybe what did go on with Israel and what we can expect in the next one. So first of all, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Danny. It's great to be here. Yeah, it's been a very, very wild week in the Middle East. So excited to get into it with you.
Yeah, and I'm sure more is yet to come. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things looming on there. But just to get everybody set up here, I want to play a couple of pieces of reports that you may have seen, and some people may not have seen, just to set the stage for what we'll be talking about here. Here's this first one that happened pretty much shortly after the attack happened, that laid out why there was what the failures in intelligence actually were.
It's beyond any expectation of what Israel thought was possible. And I think what's happened is that Israel's entire conception of its defense vis-a-vis Gaza, Hamas in Gaza, has been completely shattered. I mean, the idea that Israel could be attacked by land, sea, and air and not have any inkling that it was happening, a terrible intelligence failure, which is already being compared, of course, to the failure of 50 years ago, almost today, when Israel was surprised by Egypt and Syria. I was actually there on that day when they were attacked. It was a complete surprise, but they had intelligence information. They just didn't treat it correctly. This time they had no information, as far as we know. So that's an extraordinary failure of Israel's intelligence, of its preparations, and the pictures we're seeing of the celebrating Palestinians in Gaza is just a warning of what's going to come.
Now, one of the things she said there at the end of that segment was that this time, unlike 1973, the Israeli intelligence didn't know anything. They didn't have that. Now, as you and I have talked a little bit in some of our discussions, you're not completely sure that is accurate, that the intelligence didn't know it, but there might have been a breakdown between the intelligence and the operators. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about that this week, and I think it's helpful to start with really how the intel cycle works when it comes to terrorism, right? I mean, you have thousands of reports that come in a day on threat reporting, on possible, terrorist activity. And it's up to analysts to dig through, thousands of those reports and decide what is actionable and what is credible and what isn't. And, in kind of in the course of that, then you have to decide, when you look at that intel picture, how much warning can you provide? Can you provide tactical warning of an attack? And that means, we know X actor is going to do Y activity, at Z time and location. Or do we only have strategic warning that we can provide? Look, we know that, this particular terrorist organization may be planning an attack, and provide that to the policymaker. And then at that point, it's up to the policymaker to take some action. So in this case, even if Mossad and Shin Bet, which are excellent, very professional services, and I've worked with them, I've worked with others in the region, and they know what they're doing. But you know what? Like any intel service, they have gaps. And even if they were able to provide some strategic warning to Netanyahu, which Haaretz and others have reported might have been the case, again, not the complete picture, but at least some of it. The policymaker at that point has to take action. And again, I think, you could look at 9/11 as an interesting analogy on that process, where you had the famous PDB, right? Al-Qaeda determined to strike in the US. We don't know how, we don't know when, but we do know that something is going on. And that's where I think, the policy side also plays a role here. So I think to some degree we've seen an intel failure, but I think in certain respects we may have seen a policy failure too, especially given the level of distrust between the heads of the security services and Netanyahu over the past year, with all of this internal drama in Israel over judicial reforms and the role of the security services and everything like that. So I think that could have been a factor too.
Yeah, I think there's almost no understanding of the role that this past summer played in the divisions that it caused within Israel. That I don't think there's much of an appreciation for that in the United States, and how it had some practical implications. There was also a report on BBC of an American general who gave his assessment of kind of why these things did happen in light of what you just said. Here's his view.
How did Israeli intelligence services seemingly fail to detect Saturday's attack by Hamas? Well, retired US Army Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz served as the US security coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority until 2021.
I think the assessment is now, after 72 hours post-attack, the level of discipline that Hamas exercised in staying off of technical communications to plan this operation, this raid that they actually conducted, incursion into Israel and the terrorist acts that followed. I think that was the key, is that they're an enemy and a terrorist organization that learns not only from other terrorist organizations in the region, but also from their own experiences. And they knew that by communicating and planning using any type of technical means, the operation would have gotten compromised. So I think that's, in my assessment, based on what I've heard in open source reporting, that's the most likely way that they were able to successfully pull this off.
Now, Mike, I want to tag on to something he said there, because there was an article that you saw in the New York Times yesterday, which went into a lot of detail on this. And one of the things that really stood out to me in that article was that it said it's not merely that Hamas was good at having communications discipline and not giving away their plans when they're communicating back and forth, but that there may have been some outright deception involved with it. It said that they were talking on many networks that they knew the Israelis would be listening to, and they were talking about how they weren't ready for conflict, that they were trying to de-escalate things and whatnot. Can you tell us a little bit about how that actually works, and how can you determine whether it's disinformation or whether you're getting somebody to talk and they don't know about it?
Yeah, I think we talk about D&D, right? Denial and deception, mostly in a military context, but terrorist organizations do the same thing, and terrorist organizations have their own counterintelligence enterprises, and they are aware that a lot of their communications are being, monitored by the U.S. or Israel or other intel services, and they've shown a really remarkable ability to adapt to this kind of new world of technological surveillance that is everywhere, right? And I think a big lesson there is, when you are a way to fight back against that is to collect intel from as many sources as you can, right? We use the term all source intelligence. And I think an issue here is that the Israeli services have been over relying on technical intelligence, on SIGINT, on signals, intercepts. And that's where it can be harder to suss out some of that deception. And I think human intelligence, right, old school, spying, having a spy network of human sources is really important. And the Israelis do have that, in Gaza and in other places. But, I think, like a lot of intel services, humans, has been an issue. It's been harder to kind of keep those networks up in certain ways as everything gets so technical and there's constant surveillance of everybody. So I think—
let me ask you this, speaking about human, because there's one thing I don't really understand. And since you've worked with some of these folks, maybe you can enlighten all of us here. Most of the time, at least prior to this, the Gaza Strip was almost hermetically sealed off from the entire outside world, much less the rest of Israel. And one wonders, how does Israel have human intelligence sources within there? I mean, are they like, double agents? Does Hamas and all these other organizations in there, do they not know this? Is it actually Palestinians inside that are acting in concert, or just how do we get that? And what risk does the Israeli people have with that?
Yeah, I think, that speaks to a number of things, right? So first, the Israelis, like any intelligence, enterprise, has the issue of, if you're trying to, recruit sources out of mostly a hostile population, you're going to have issues with credibility, and you're going to have issues with, developing good sources in those places. So I think even if they, even to the extent you can develop sources in Gaza, which is hard to do for a number of the reasons that you said, the quality of those assets, I think, is very much in question, given that, they could be feeding information to the Israelis on behalf of Hamas, on behalf of PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another, terrorist group that's active there. So I think that becomes a problem. And that does speak to, even humans can be hard to rely on when you're trying to draw, a spy network out of a population that, may have a motive to be dishonest with you, even if they are, part of the, Israeli intelligence program. But I think we don't know much about, the Israeli networks in Gaza. And I think, to your point, they haven't really had the opportunity to maintain them, at least in person, because, it's entirely closed off. So I think there's a number of things there. And I think if you look at the NYT reporting, they also mentioned even things like the, communications posts along the Gaza border. Hamas was able to use drones as loitering munitions and take those out. I mean, so there's a lot of vulnerability when you're only relying on one particular kind of intelligence.
Yeah, there was another part of that article that really stood out to me, which I think kind of speaks to the difficulty of keeping your eyes open all the time and not becoming so strained that you get tired and you stop paying attention. Because this past summer, there was a spike in activity over there that had everybody's focus and attention. A lot of protests from the Palestinian side. 200 and something Palestinians were killed by the Israeli Defense Forces during that time. So there was lots of tensions. But then around September, it seemed that it started settling down. And I think that especially as it got into the holiday, the Yom Kippur holiday, for the Israelis, that they lowered their guard and they relied on these forward posts that you're talking about, the electronic, the signals from the cameras themselves. And a lot of them were just not on duty. They were just kind of off because they thought it was the risk was not great. No one was prepared for this. Even if there was some of the strategic warnings you're talking about, there was no imminent threat that seemed to be, at least was communicated to the IDF on the ground. And just how hard is that to continue to pay attention to those things, to not get caught off guard, and especially when there's never been an incursion of this scale that totally caught everybody by surprise.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's very hard to stay vigilant in the counterterrorism fight. And as somebody that has gone after Al-Qaeda, gone after ISIS, I can tell you, you really cannot ever let your guard down, and you have to constantly be assessing vectors for attack. And holidays traditionally are a time to expect attacks and to increase collection, which is why I think it's disappointing in some regard that their guard was let down a bit. But it's also natural, right? When you're relying on a lot of these listening posts and other things, people are people, and they're going to focus on other things during the holidays. They're gonna have a lot on their mind, and I think that's part of it too. The New York Times reporting mentioned a case where there was a warning that was sent out from one of these posts that apparently nobody read. And so, the constant need for vigilance is probably the toughest part of counterterrorism. And to your point, I think, the Israelis let some of that slip at this particular juncture, which is very tragic.
So then I think maybe the bigger question is, has the focus on the catastrophic Israeli collapse of their intelligence service, has that maybe been a little bit overblown? Because it occurs to me that it was an inflection point in time, and we're talking like decades of time where nothing had ever happened to this, so nobody was looking for that scale of thing to go on anyway. And definitely they missed something. So I'm not trying to suggest there wasn't a major failure, but it's also true that on the other side, the Hamas side, and actually I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that from your own experience, perhaps, is how effective is the Hamas side from able to deceive the Israeli people, or to lull them to sleep, and what kind of things are available to them? Because we think of the Palestinian side as being very low tech and not having anywhere near the sensors or the aerial observance, whatever, that the Israelis have. So it seems like it should be an unfair advantage. But sometimes, if I recall what you've told me in the past correctly, is that low tech can actually lull the high tech into sleep. And tell us a little bit about how that might have happened from their side.
Yeah, we've seen this in the fight to find bin Laden as well. He was relying on couriers and quite literally, physical mail and things like that. I mean, the low tech thing can be an advantage in a world where all of this, focus, all this money has been spent, around the world by various intel services on technical collection and improving that aspect of collection. You actually can miss things if people are not using phones and people are not using, devices and things like that. So I think in some ways, the fact that Hamas is less technically sophisticated than the Israelis could have been an advantage here. And to some degree, the Hamas side of it, if they were able to, use their time, right? It's kind of, we haven't seen, a flare up like this in a long time, to your point, but we did see a couple of flare ups, over the past several years in Gaza. And I think Hamas's takeaway was to put their things together for, to pull their resources together for something big like this. And again, I don't think we have a ton of details yet on any kind of Iranian involvement. The intel community, there was reporting this a couple hours ago that the intel community is not currently assessing that Iran directed Hamas to do this. Obviously, we know Iran has very strong ties to Hamas and has provided them with weapons and money and everything for years. But there's also a very important intel point there that directing an attack and being part of that C2 node and actually issuing instructions to Hamas is very different from providing that assistance. So I think it'll be interesting. That's a preliminary assessment, but I think it'll be interesting to see if we get more information on any kind of potential Iranian involvement. But for now, it does look like, Hamas at least, took this on themselves to launch this attack.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question from one of our viewers there. We always appreciate that externally involvement there. And what about that point in terms of specifically whether it maybe even expand a little bit beyond that, like perhaps from Hezbollah or from the PIJ that you mentioned a minute ago? What kind of specific intelligence help could they even get from those actors that could help out in this case for this operation?
Yeah, there may have well been, Iranian intel support, to Hamas in their planning for this attack. And I think, we may see reporting on that over the next couple of weeks and months. And so we'll keep an eye out for that. But, we know that, as far as weapons and funding and everything else, Iran has, long provided that stuff to Hamas. And I guess, some people may look at it as, splitting hairs, but, they've provided that support. And so I think at the very least, you could say that they are, indirectly culpable. But I think there is a different level when we look at it from an intel perspective of intimate involvement with the attack. And I don't think we've seen that yet. We also know that, there are other links that Iran has to Hezbollah and other groups in the north. And, there was some, people got very, spun up a couple hours ago on this notion of possible incursion, in Lebanon by Hezbollah. So, that's something to keep an eye out for too. The U.S. has kind of made it clear to the Israelis that, we are, we could step in to provide support if another front is opened in the conflict. And I think that's something to look out for what Hezbollah chooses to do. To this point, they have not committed a lot of their forces. And so, we'll see how that plays out.
We will see that. And we're about to run out of time here, but I did want to get one more important question asked to you, because it's going to be really important coming up. We've been talking about the past and what has happened, with the initial failures, but obviously everybody's paying attention now. But now the next biggest process in this war, the next big phase, is the looming Israeli incursion into the Gaza Strip and into Gaza City. And as an operator, from my perspective, I know that we don't plan any kind of a major offensive operation like this, especially into a very densely packed and tightly filled up urban zone, unless we have really good intelligence first. Because if I don't have good intel on where the enemy is, what kind of environment we may be going into, it's going to be nearly impossible to come up with a good plan of action, because otherwise, how do we even know where to set objectives? So I wonder if you have any knowledge about, how the Israeli intelligence is now going to try to rebound from what it did, but how is it even going to know where Hamas may be in there? And of course, that includes some of these particular potential people who have been kidnapped and the hostages. And I don't know how that's going to be navigated, but tell us about how difficult it's going to be for Israeli intelligence now, and what can they do to help this incursion?
Yeah, I think, the time for the Israelis to finger point and discuss whether or not this is an intel failure or a policy failure, or it's both, or it's some, or whatever, that all is going to need to happen potentially years from now. The focus now for the Israelis on the intel side is to put together a picture of what's going on in the air and in the ground, and then to work with, obviously, the military planners in the war cabinet to decide, what kinds of courses of action make the most sense in Gaza. I mean, obviously, they went in on the ground in a major way for the last time in 2014 with Operation Protective Edge, and that didn't go as well for the IDF. So I think they're gonna. The reason we've seen them take their time is they need to coordinate on the intel side and decide exactly what targets they want to go after, and decide exactly what is worth striking and what isn't. And I think that's all a big part of the process now. And then, of course, the U.S. is going to provide some of that intel assistance as well. We have carrier strike groups in the region, that have, ELINT capability, that have ISR capability, that can provide some of that overhead support to the Israelis. And then I think,
so specifically though, in the city itself, in the urban area, how can Israel or anyone know, all right, there's a machine gun nest here, they're in the basement of this building here, they're not even in these buildings, so just avoid them and go over here? How can you even get that kind of fidelity so they don't go in blind?
Well, and I think part of it is the fact that you can't. Some of these things are very hard to assess and determine from an intel perspective when you're talking about underground tunnel networks that span miles. A lot of it you're relying on historical intel from Operation Protective Edge, from previous Israeli raids and operations in Gaza. They can rely on a lot of that historical intel. There's also a lot of advantage in persistent surveillance overhead. And so I think you'll see a lot of drones providing full motion video and other things like that to try to keep eyes on really every inch of the Gaza Strip, because that's really the only way that you can develop an intel picture in such a densely packed urban area with a lot of closed buildings and like I said, underground tunnels. I mean, it's going to be very hard from an intelligence perspective for the Israelis to do that. And I think part of the calculation that they have to make is, to some extent, there are going to be gaps, and they have to decide, are they okay with that? And what could the casualties look like?
They're going to have to be okay with it, whether they want to or not, because that's just the best you can get. Intel's never perfect, and it's going to be a challenge this time, because just like the Hamas side was using deception before, I'm sure that they'll be doing another level of it here. And man, this is going to be. I just do not envy Israel here. It's going to be a very, very difficult fight. Mike, we really appreciate your insights here. It's been fascinating and really helpful to our audience. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Danny. Appreciate it.
You bet. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. See ya.